So could you explain your role in the Kansas City, Missouri School District as a community member during the years of desegregation?
In 1954, I was a sophomore in college at Lincoln Junior College, the all-black junior college, because we couldn't attend the junior college at the Kansas City Junior College at 39th and McGee. And when the decision was handed down on that 17th day of May 1954, the Warren Court, as is known, Supreme Court, said that desegregation should take place with all deliberate speed. And so 1954 was the last year of segregation in public education, at least in the Kansas City School District. A number of the school districts did not comply fully, but Kansas City. So the fall of the 55-56 school year, they closed the R.T. Cole's vocational high school, and all the black kids that were there had to go to manual. A number of black teachers lost their jobs because of that, because there was no room in the end, for them to go. Interesting also that as that took place, some of the best teachers were sent to like Southwest, and one teacher in particular, who was a great drama teacher, who was at Central High School, went to Southwest. And her last name was Scott, Andrea Scott, I think was her name, and put on all kind of plays. Well, you see, Central began to change probably first after Manual because of the white flight population shift, and it became more and more African American. So that whole period was not only dealt with education, but it also dealt with public accommodations 10 years later, fair housing 14 years later, 1968, and continuous white flight. And those schools became more darker and more dark and more dark as white flight took place. James Hazlitt was the superintendent of schools. There was certainly, the real resistance came when busing became an issue. And white parents didn't want to send their kids to the black schools, Lincoln, Emmanuel, Central. And it was okay if the black kids were bused out, but cross-busing was rejected and resented. But that whole period continued, the white flight continued, and the efforts to desegregate was not as successful as the court had intended and many of the African American parents had intended, because then there was some resentment and rejection on the part of the black population, black parents, because they felt that there was a feeling that the only way that black kids could learn is sitting with white kids. And we knew that was not true, because we turned out some great students from Lincoln and R.T. Cole's who went to institution of higher learning with 4 points pluses. Our instructors were PhDs and master's degrees, great instructors who were able to teach colleges, and many of them were teaching both at the high school level, and many of them also were teaching at the junior college level there at Lincoln. I guess the question was integration, desegregation a success in that period of time? Far from being a success. Because you had, in most of these schools had white teachers who had never had any social relationship with black people, and particularly black students. And so then there were confrontations at times. And I think that that the whole intent of Brown versus Board of Education, based on the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, and that's what Thurgood Marshall ordered the second time. As is known, the first time, Chief Justice Vinson was there, and the case was argued. But Chief Justice Vinson died, and so the case had to be reorganized, and that's when Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren, who was a former governor of California. And in reading Warren's memoirs, he said that he would not bring the case up. Chief Justice has the decision as to when the case comes up for a hearing. He said he would not bring the case up until he had 9 votes. And so he got his 9 votes, and Thurgood Marshall argued it, along with some others. But in the second trial, second case, Thurgood Marshall used the 14th Amendment, and he started off with, I quote, "Of all the multitudinous groups of people in this nation, why do you treat Negroes differently?" And that's where equal protection under the law came in. And of course, it was not accepted well throughout the white community, but it was law. And of course, we know of some resistance from people like George Wallace at University of Alabama, segregation yesterday, today, and forever. So I think the intent, the court's intent, was honorable, morally honorable. But white America was not ready for desegregation. Now, in many of the quarters, some schools were already desegregated, like in the north and in the west. But the border states and the southern states fought it up until, and many of them still had to go to court because, or enjoin with an injunction because they violated the law. But Kansas City was no more, no less, it was just a microcosm of what America was about at the time. Well, there was some apprehension. There was some people were happy that if not now, when that we'll be able to get better schools. I can recall that we got a 4th edition of books, for example, and the white kids got 5th edition, and we became pen pals. Mm-hmm. They wrote little notes to us because they knew they were coming to the black schools. There was not a whole, I think I can comfortably say, and honestly say, that it was not a lot of jubilation because of Brown versus Board of Education, although the separate but equal based on Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896 is null and void now. Mm-hmm. But the melody of racism lingered on today.
So what kind of notes would be in those books? I've always been curious.
They call us the N-word and all the black sambo and all those kind of things.
Okay, so it wasn't necessarily friendly notes.
Oh God, no. They were. That's why when I said pen pals, I said they were tongue in cheek. Mm-hmm. I didn't. No, they were not. No one. Because they got the new books. We had the old edition, but we had to take the same test to graduate. The same test to get into. I came here at Kansas City University in the fall of 1956, and the university had not lived up to Brown versus Board of Education. There were no black faculty at the time, and I think the first African American that came was in the English department, Miss Williams.
That's her name.
Dr. Williams.
Dr. Williams.
And I was trying to think of her first name. Was it Sylvia or Evelyn?
No, it wasn't Evelyn, but I
Yeah,
remember
Dr.
the
Williams, yeah.
'cause that's
My
her name.
brilliant woman. And then Dr. Andrew Dorton,
Dorton.
science.
Dr. Dorton, who was the principal.
Yeah, he was my principal at Dunbar Elementary School pre-1954. He was a science teacher, brilliant. So when I say that of the 10 high schools, 2 black, 8 white, that we had as many and maybe more PhDs and master's degrees in those 2 black schools than they had in the 8 white schools. Brilliant minds, brilliant minds. But so not only were the elementary, junior high as they call them then, and high schools still making those kind of things, trying to make those changes. And if I fast forwarded to when Bob Wheeler became the assistant superintendent in urban education, I left the police department in the fall of 1964, and I first became a homeschool coordinator, and then when Bob became the assistant superintendent in urban education, and Dr. A. Leedy Campbell, who was the principal at Lincoln Junior, but when I went to R.T. Coles, he was vice principal, and Dr. Thomas, Dr. Harwell, and Dr. Campbell were there at R.T. Coles. But just prior to that, Dr. Thomas and
when I went to Lincoln Junior, Dr. Campbell was there.
Yes,
I think this was the 1960.
Yes. But see, so Bob, Dr. Campbell and Bob hired me from the homeschool, from the pupil services department, which was the homeschool coordinator. Old what do they call them at that time? Truant officers.
Yes.
But it was a lot more.
Found the kids who were playing hooky from school.
Okay, but also when they changed it to homeschool coordinator, we worked with kids who on lunch programs, and shoes and glasses and all those kind of things. But I went to work in urban education as director. I don't know, they don't call it direct coordinator of community relations and parental participation, I think was my title. And then busing was still an issue. And the first Head Start program, Bob asked me if I would work with that just to recruit kids. But I never shall forget, I was at a meeting at Northeast High School, and the late Miss Lucille Bluford, manager of Kansas, called. I took her there, I picked her up that Saturday morning, I think, and went over there at Northeast Junior High. And they were talking about Lincoln High School, because they changed it from high school. It wasn't academy, then it was something that they had to change the name. Maybe it was academy. They changed the name to get funding, Title I funding. And we went there, and the people, one prominent Kansas Citian called our kids animals in the cafeteria of Northeast Junior High School. No, not animals, savages. They act like savages, and we don't want them on there. So even in that period of time, because I joined Bob and Dr. Campbell in 65 school year, I think it was. Yes, 65 school year, 65, 66, because I was a homeschool coordinator just for about a year. And I worked with, and so we had to try to make Lincoln integrated. And Bob asked me to work on that part, trying to get kids from the various schools who were 3-point and above, because that's what you had to maintain to get into Lincoln. And then Marge Allen of the Powell family, a very morally and ethically sound, committed woman who happened to be Caucasian. We were a team, and she was trying to recruit the white kids, and I was recruiting the black. I didn't have any problem recruiting the black kids. She had a problem recruiting the white kids, but he asked the two of us to do that. So all of this ties into the shadows of, if you will, Brown versus Board of Education. And then when you had public accommodations 10 years later, the federal government passed public accommodations, the state did, and then the city did, under the leadership of Ike Davis, who was the mayor. Dr. Thomas and Dr. Earl Thomas and Bruce Watkins were the first two, Dr. Thomas and Blankenship, Larry Blankenship, were the first two black city council persons to serve representing the 3rd district. So the city passed an ordinance, and keep in mind all this tied in together. Education, public accommodations, fair housing, all connected. And so when the city passed this fair housing, public accommodations, a group of tavern owners headed by a fellow at Genova's Inn over at 12th and Chestnut, it's called Chestnut Inn, I think, and the fellow's name was Genova, started this petition and for a referendum and put it on the ballot. And the white community, particularly the Jewish community, supported it, and it barely passed public accommodations. That was in '64. Then in 1968, the federal government passed housing, and the state passed housing, and in January of '68, the city passed its fair housing. And a referendum, that same group got together to deal with the put it on the ballot. But then when the kids on the 9th of April, 1968, because it was supposed to come up for vote, walked out because Jim Hazlitt and the others refused to close the schools, my son and I went to Memphis to participate in the symbolic march where Mrs. Coretta Scott King was the speaker. And we came back. We were going over to Morehouse, but we couldn't get a flight out, so we came back to Kansas City. And I was working for Dr. Campbell and Bob. And there was a meeting that evening. My wife said, well, Bob Wheeler called and said, you're supposed to be in the superintendent's office this evening. That was Monday evening, the 8th of April. After Dr. King was killed on the 4th, that Thursday. This was the 8th, that Monday. And the subject was whether or not they ought to open the schools the next day. And there were about 8 white men, old white men, along with Hazlitt was out of town in Washington. He was on the phone. No speakerphone then, nothing like that, but he was on the phone. And they decided about 8 or 9 to 3, the 3 of us, to open the schools. And we said, if you open the schools and Kansas City, Kansas is out, those kids are going to come over here, disrupt things, or these kids are going to be going out themselves. And it happened. They started at Lincoln and then Central. And then they marched, and I'll fast forward to the point that they wanted to rally at City Hall. And that's when the riots started. And that's the year that Mr. J.D. Williams got the contract to bus the kids. And it's a long story there. Sometimes we'll get into that. But I called him and I said, I was the last speaker on the steps of City Hall, and I was at the school district. And I called Mr. Williams. I said, Mr. Williams, it is very tense. I said, we got about 1,000+ kids down here. And if you could just send maybe 6 or so buses. So because Father Gibbons over at Holy Name Catholic Church, where they had Teen Town, said he would open the kids could come over there. KPRS, our personality, announced that he would be there. And the kids went there, and the police shot tear gas in the basement of the church. That next morning, which was the 10th, we were over there at Lincoln High School. National Guard had been brought in by the governor, Warren Hearns, and we're riding 4 deep, 2 guards and 2 police in cars. We were right behind them in front of Lincoln High School, 2111 Woodland. And they were taunting the kids and giving them the finger and everything. and the kids started throwing whatever they could find, and they shot tear gas in the school. One officer even threw one in the girls' restroom. So all of that's a part of where we were in Kansas City during that turbulent time from 1955 up until probably about 1970. But then that escalated white flight, and the burning and the looting and all that. Police killed 5 black men during that period of time. 4 at 30th and Prospect. And that heated things up, and it spilled over into the schools. And again, and when Bob Wheeler became superintendent of the schools, the civic and business community did not support him because Bob was brilliant. I mean, brilliant. Didn't have a PhD, but he was a brilliant man. Had gone to Washington as a commissioner of education and come back and was. Bob was a proud African American man, arrogant. And that didn't gel too well with the white establishment. And its support of education, Kansas City schools, fell off. Now, one other thing with regard to that. Early on, to become a member of the school board, you had to be endorsed either by the Jackson County Republicans or the Jackson County Democrats. They cross-endorsed each other, so you could never break that. But Dr. Carl Peterson was a write-in candidate, and write-in candidates regardless are very difficult. But we almost made it, but we didn't make it. But then Dr. John Ramos, an anesthesiologist, was the first African-American to be on the school board. And then they broke it up, had to go to the state to do it, where a person were elected from sub-districts and districts.
Wow, okay. So as a community member, how did efforts to integrate schools affect your role in the district? And you also had a key role as homeschool coordinator. So how did all of that affect what you did?
But it started when I was on the police department.
Okay.
I came on the police department in 1954. Right after I finished my second year of junior college, I came on the police department. And after I had finished probation, that's when I started at KCU, which became University of Missouri Kansas City, part of the Missouri system. So I, as a police officer, I made, as a district officer, I was limited in terms, because black officers were limited in terms of where they could ride. But when I became a detective, I kind of floated, and many of the principals knew me. So there were problems, black-white problems. There were problems not only with the students in the schools, but there were problems in the neighborhoods, and a lot of mediation going on, bringing parents together in school. But so that was pretty much my role as a mediator, not only to work on crime among youth 16 and under, but also that kind of work. And Swope Park was an interesting place. 1952, the park department closed the Swope Park swimming pool rather than allow blacks to swim. And then a suit was filed in 1954 by 3 black plaintiffs and sued, and then Judge Ridge, federal district judge, ruled that they had to open it. But that had nothing to do with other public accommodation. But all of this tied in together. And see, so you really can't talk about education during this period unless you talk about public accommodation, fair housing, and public accommodation was a part of like swimming hotels and all like that were public. So I was. It was a period that I should never forget, because I came out of the pre-1954 group.
So what do you recall as academic outcomes for students, the focus on those academic during this period?
Well, I think I really think for a period of time we got a better education under segregation than we did under desegregation. Had a lot of committed teachers who lived in the community there with you. You live next door to Professor Harwell or Professor Thomas or Professor Cameron or Professor Herford. You live in the same community. They knew you, and their wives and their husbands and whatever the case went to the same beauty shops, barber shop, nightclubs, churches together, and teachers taught for you to learn rather than teaching for a living. And there was no fear. You had very little incorrigible situations going on. And then when desegregation took place with white teachers, there was that fear. So it was. I don't think for a period of time that many of our students were as successful. Had nothing to do with their mind, having to do who was teaching them and where it was, based on the bus and all. So I think that it was a period there lull in graduation rate among black students and who went to the prestigious college as well as the traditional black schools. Those were those colleges were a part of the NCS.
So what might have been some of the social outcomes for students as a result of school desegregation?
I think over time that changed, but there were some turbulent moments there in the immediate shadows of the first from '55 when. But I think after a while, and it began to change. Social patterns began to change. There was this. And in fair housing, although there was still discrimination from lending institutions, and black folks paid more interest and churches moved, people moved, and I think there was more of a socialization over time because it was something new, and there was on both sides there was hostility. Kids who were in a minority in those particular schools, and then what happened, the more the school changed from white to black, there was things that occurred there. You found a lot more, less, I think, accomplishments on the part of education, and younger teachers coming in, and there was a program called CUTE, Cooperative Urban Teacher Education Program, and I worked in that program. Emma Jane Clark and Dr. Manny, he just wrote a book, and I just reviewed it for him and spoke at his 95th anniversary.
I was wondering where he was.
Yeah.
Dr. Manny?
Manny, I'm trying to think of his last name.
He was with the CUTE program.
Yes, he was there, yeah. And Emma Jane Clark, who was with the school district, but went into that program too, yeah. Just 2 weeks ago, I spoke at his retirement.
Oh, wow. So in what ways might school integration have shaped Kansas City communities?
I think it was an intertwine. I don't think that you can compartmentalize either one of those. I think that you can't talk about one without talking about the other, and particularly fair housing, because that changed the complexion of the schools as people moved. And people in the white community began to move out of the Kansas City School District into what was then called the Suburban School District, Center School District, Hickman Mill School District. Independence School District was, many of the Kansas City schools were in the city of Independence. And then there was a move back a few years ago to those schools back in Van Horn and high school and the middle school over there. But I call it seceding from the Union again. But I think overall, the riot did not help in a number of respects. Did not help the social climate. Did not help the economic climate, the housing, all that. But I think Kansas City, 21st century, is a much better city than it was during the era that we've discussed. I think that you had more people who were elected to the state offices, as well as the school board, as well as the city government, the federal government. The 5th District has been held by African American for a number of years. Alan Wheat was first, and then now Reverend Cleaver, Congressman Cleaver. And so I think, and he had the first African American police chief. So all of this is progress, but we still have a long way to go. A long way to go, and the climate that we're in now is frightening. The climate we're in now is frightening because racism and bigotry, homophobia, Islamophobia, all those have surfaced now, and it's frightening, and it's a setback. It's a setback for people of color, as well as people of faith other than Christians, Jewish and Muslims, Islamic faith and Jewish faith, Jews, and you see bigotry is merged during this period of time, which is not helpful.
So what changes do you think are needed to improve outcomes for students in today's urban schools?
A good question, because our urban kids are suffering regardless of what their ethnic or racial identity might be. And I think that the disproportionate number of young folks who are left out because of funding, because of the formula, and then you have a lot of mental health issues now, based on alcoholism and drugs and all that kids bring to school. And I think that a lot more attention has to be given to education. And I believe that public education will always be number one in America. That kids will not be able to, family will not be able to send their kids to parochial and private schools. So, I mean, to the public schools, whether it's a charter school, which is public, or the regular public schools. And I think if you look at state budgets and federal budgets, state budgets in particular, more money is spent on prisoners than spent on students. And that's frightening. And prison population folk get a raise, the warden and the guards and all those folks that make that up get raises that teachers don't get. And so I think when you look at that, there's a differential in terms of the amount, in terms of the salaries, but you find that budgets for prisons continue to go up, and cut back in education and public health or mental health.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything else that you would like to share with us regarding school integration in Kansas City?
Well, it's something I think that we have to continue to work at. I think it has to be a collaboration between the business community, the civic community, the philanthropic community. Schools can't do it just with federal and state funds. I think that others have to put in, adopt schools, have to also offer scholarships. I think teaching, schools of education have to be able to teach teachers to teach in poor and disadvantaged communities as well as the suburban communities. I think they had to be very careful sending new teachers, new white teachers into urban schools who've had no relationship with Hispanic and with disadvantaged kids regardless of their race. I think that there has to be a declaration that we're going to raise the the achievement level of kids regardless of where they are, and set goals. Not only do the school district, and as you know, there are 14 school districts within the corporate limits of Kansas City, 14 different school districts, and they're separate and unequal to some degree based on what the Supreme Court said in 1954. And I think we need to look at that. We need to really not only look at that. I think we already know. It's a matter now, where do you put money in the front end or put it in the back end with the dropouts? Because if all credible studies that have been conducted show that kids who, now it's nothing wrong with getting a GED, but a credible studies show that if you walk across that stage and shake hands with the president and others on stage, that your achievement level after that is much greater than it is otherwise. And so either you're going to spend money to educate kids, regardless of where they are, complement that with mental health support, with teachers who are there to teach for the profession rather than for a living, and that's a sure way of keeping kids out of the criminal justice system. And you find who occupies prisons in America? The poor and disadvantaged and uneducated. And this is a great nation, the greatest nation in the world. But education is not first and foremost. It's talked about, but in terms of putting your money where your mouth is, in terms of having the kind of outcomes that our kids are capable of developing with the right educational setting, the right teachers. I went to one school district. I have two grandsons that just came out of Olathe School District. And you go to those schools, it looks like a college campus. Mm-hmm. And our schools are 1920 vintage, with no rolling hills and grass and this. And so someone said, well, when we all came through prior 54, we were there. But we had different teachers too. And although we were segregated, although the African American community during that up to Fair House in 1968 the African American community was from Independence Avenue to roughly 27th Street, from Charlotte over to Prospect. That was a cultural mecca for the African American community, but because, as I said before, everybody lived there. There were little pockets. I grew up in the Dunbar area out near Veterans Hospital. That was over 14th and Jackson, Bruce School, around St. Luke's Hospital, Penn School. Mm-hmm. Then over on the west side there, with Hispanic and black and white over there, about 60% Hispanic and 20% black and white. But it's education. There are so-called third world nations. That used to be called third world nations. But when you look for engineers and medical folks, where are they coming from? Like India, Pakistan, places other than we're not producing those folks fast enough. In the medical field as well as in the engineering field, which says something to us, ought to say something to us. And so we got a long way to go.
A long way to go.
Yes.
Well, thank you.